Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Henning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. The Timaeus is usually considered one of Plato's most scientific works. In it, we are introduced to the figure of the demiurge, the supremely benevolent craftsman, or poietes, of the universe. Like the Hebrew God in the book of Genesis, this demiurge does not create the universe out of nothing. Instead, he takes pre-existing chaotic matter and fashions it into an orderly cosmos, in this case, using the eternal, perfect forms as his blueprint. And because the demiurge is good, he wants the world to be as much like himself as possible, orderly, beautiful, and intelligent. The universe he creates is thus a living creature which has its own soul, the world soul. And this is what governs the motion of the heavens and conducts them according to mathematical and harmonic proportions and principles. The dialogue is about more than cosmogony and cosmology, though. In the last part of it, human beings become the subject. And here we're given an account of the human tripartite soul and a conception of physical health as both a balance of the four elements within the body and a proper alignment of the soul's rotations with the rotations of the universe. So ultimately, we learn from the Timaeus that the universe we inhabit is not a product of chance, but a real work of art. It was designed by a benevolent, loving creator according to mathematical principles, and human beings are an important part of its celestial music, the music of the spheres. If that set of ideas kind of sounds familiar to you, even if you haven't read the Timaeus, well, that's not a coincidence either. For nearly 2 millennia, from Plato's own day in the 4th century in Athens to the scientific revolution, this text shaped how intellectuals and artists in the European West imagined the physical universe and some of the details of its creation. While the Greek East and the Islamic world, of course, never lost the full text of the Timaeus and developed their own rich, prolific scientific and medical traditions out of it, the Latin West lived for centuries with only a portion of it, in the form of a Latin translation produced in the 4th century CE, the only Plato known in Western Europe for centuries. In his new book, Timaeus in Paradise, just out with Princeton University Press, Piero Boitani shows, through dozens of short lyrical essays and explorations, how, thanks in large part to that Latin translation, the Timaeus came to inspire countless sublime works of poets, artists, and scientists. Boethius and Dante, Botticelli and Raphael, even Kepler and Heisenberg, all found inspiration in the dialogue's presentation of the creator as a sublime mathematician. In our conversation, Piero will be giving just a hint of the immense ground over which his dazzling essays range. Like the Timaeus itself, his book has something for everyone. Piero Boitani is Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature at the University of Rome Sapienza. A Fellow of the British Academy, the Medieval Academy of America, the Accademia dei Lincei, and the Italian National Institute of Astrophysics, in 2016 he received the Balzan Prize for Comparative Literature. He is chairman of the Fondazione Lorenzo Valla and general editor of its series of Greek and Latin writers. His most recent books include Il Grande Racconto dei Classici, Bologna, Il Mulino, 2024, a book which he'll mention in our conversation on Anagnopsis in Western literature, which came out in Paris with Garnier in 2025, and Timaeus in Paradise. A new book, The Five Elements, I Cinque Elementi, with a preface by Stephen Greenblatt, will be published by Mondadori in its distinguished Lo Specchio series in February 2026. Just a quick note that, as ever, I have put a few references in the show notes for this episode. Remember, too, that Lesche is on Instagram, at Lesche Podcast, and I will be posting some images to accompany this episode there. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Piero Boitani. The next voice you'll be hearing is his.
The book has an interesting story, in a sense. It all started because in 2022, the Fondazione Valla published this edition of the Timaeus, which has a new text and a big commentary, and it really is quite something. And I am the general editor of this series, so I was asked to go to a launch, an official launch of thing, in Pavia, and I had to say a few words. And the one thing that I wanted to say was a passage from Dante, in Paradiso, where Beatrice tells him, now when you have reached this point in heaven, you can see that what Plato says about the return of the soul to its star after death is not true. You can actually see it with your own eyes. Unless, of course, Plato speaks by metaphor, and that is the same way in which the Bible treats things, and the Holy Church as well, giving hands and feet to God, which is, of course, literally not true, but it means something. The anthropomorphic form of God has several meanings. And now this struck me as a very wonderful way of putting it, because Dante was picking up Plato. And of course, the Timaeus was the only dialogue of Plato which was known in the Middle Ages, most of it anyway, done by a Latin translation by Calcidius. So he had obviously read it, and he was taking it from there. Although Dante is mostly an Aristotelian, but he gets closer and closer to Plato, I think, in the Paradiso, that is, when he describes heaven and the blessed souls of heaven. So I wanted to say that, and I also found a passage in Ezra Pound, when Pound says Pound, of course, was a genius in a sort of way, in a sort of mad way, but he says that people who don't know think that the Platonic urge for supreme beauty is, something very strange and never described really except by Plato. And he says, no, if you take Dante's Paradiso, you have precisely that same description which you can get in the Phaedrus, in Symposium, and so on. Now, this gave me ideas, and at this point, being retired, I can do whatever I like in my time. I started writing an essay, which got longer and longer, as it were. Finally, it was about 50 pages, and I sent it to my good friends, Pat Boyd of Cambridge, Italianist, famous Dante scholar, and Lino Pertile at Harvard, who's also a Dante scholar. And they said, oh, wonderful, wonderful, just go on and on and on. I finished it. And at this point, I went to the launch of some book, I can't remember, but a former pupil of mine, who now works for a publisher in Rome, was there, and I was talking about this essay, and I've been very enthusiastic. And she said, well, why don't you give it to me? Just send it to me. I would love to read it. And I did. And then a week later, she said, well, why don't we publish it as a small book? We'll put the text of the Timaeus as well, so as to make it slightly fatter. And I said, well, no. If you want to do it, then I would like to go over it and redo it, as it were. And then I had a terrible accident. I fell in the street and broke shoulder, nose, everything. I was in hospital and so on. When I came back home, there wasn't much I could do. One morning I woke up with some lines in English dancing in my head, and they were clearly related to Plato and the Timaeus, because it was Socrates saying 1, 2, 3, which is the beginning of the Timaeus. So I wrote them down, and it didn't stop there. It went on. Why in English, I really don't know. But anyway, English is a second language to me, of course, but it's not mother tongue, if you see what I mean. Anyway, I had just seen Michael Longley, this Northern Irish poet, quite a famous one. And so I sent it to him. I sent about 100 lines or so. And Michael said, well, this is completely unexpected, because it's the first poetry I ever wrote since the age of 18 or something. And then at that time he was Italian, not English. He said, well, this is a cascade. This is a spring shower, an April shower. Go ahead and do it. And so I went on, and in the end wrote about 3,000 lines. and that was called Plato's Poem. And it's really quite similar to the book, Timaeus in Paradise, in the sense that the itinerary it traces is similar. But of course, the characters are fictional, they talk to each other, and scenes are scenes, dramatic scenes. And I get into it as well as a person or persona. And it has an ending, which is not in the Timaeus in Paradise. It has an ending which talks about the muse Polymnia, which I take as my muse, and about the dying Gaul, the famous statue in the Capitoline Museum, which are my two sort of basic inspirations. And then a really good poet, Italian poet, offered to translate this into Italian, and he did it. And he found a publisher for me. I don't know, publishers of poetry. I don't know. I've only written essays and historical books and so on, or literary books. And so the poem was about to come out. In the meantime, I was also reshaping the essay, 50 pages long, and it became a longish essay, which followed more or less the footsteps of the poem. But of course, it had all the annotation. It was, as a good friend of mine, an English friend of mine, Terence Cave, said, he said, well, the poem in this case is, the gloss, the scholium, scholia precedes the actual poem. It comes out before the poem, because the Italian edition of the Timaeus in Paradise was going to come out before the actual poem. Then they more or less coincided. Terence Cave, gave me a lot of advice and was completely flabbergasted by the fact that after 50 years of being a critic and an historian of literature and so on, I had turned to poetry. It was very exciting for me, but less so for other people. Anyway, liked it a lot. And then finally, I don't know how I decided to get to Princeton, but anyway, for the English edition, one friend of ours, who was professor of English literature at Naples, who lives in Rome, however, liked the book so much, the Italian book, that when I asked her, well, would you like to translate it? She said, oh, yes, I'd love it. She didn't know what she had embarked on, but she did, Jane Wilkinson, and she did. I mean, I followed it step by step, and she did a very good job, and I think it's a very good translation. Then I added pieces here and there and made it, added episodes which were not in the Italian edition, and whatever it's called, the afterword, I think, or the final thing is a new thing. It's something that came from an article I had published for a book in Cambridge. It was a lecture I had given in Paris and in Jerusalem, eventually in French. Anyway, so the book finally came as it is now, as it were, with all these things added to it. And then I also chose illustrations, which I thought were needed because the influence of the Timaeus is visual as much as literary or philosophical, in that in the Middle Ages they thought that in the Timaeus, Plato was giving an explanation of the creation and the creation process of God's creation, and therefore they were very excited. They thought, this is wonderful. It's not a non-Christian but inspired writer, this guy. So they used the thing. I found a thing coming from Chartres, for instance, and so that would be mostly sculpture. And then this crypt in Anagni, which is really a kind of jewel, under the earth, buried, but you can visit it, and it is absolutely strange. It's a kind of Sistine Chapel of the Middle Ages, painted all over. There's not a square inch left without a painting. And then the theme of creation, of course, goes on from the Bible and Plato all the way down to at least the 16th century, at least to Michelangelo, 16th chapter. So that was what kept me busy both in the poem and in the scholia, as it were, the book, Timaeus in Paradise.
Your book, as I was saying in the pre-recording, it's really a tour de force, and it follows the Timaeus and its influence across more than 2,000 years of intellectual history and artistic history, creative history, spiritual, religious history. What inspired you to take on such an ambitious chronology?
Well, I've done that sort of thing quite often. It's not the first, it might be the last, given my age, but it's not the first one. I had written a tome which has come out in English, unfortunately, not a particularly good edition in the States, but which was called in Italian Il Grande Racconto delle Stelle, Great Story of Stars. And it's a fat tome that came out in 2012. And that was the story of stars in painting, literature, theology, whatever you can name it, all over the world for about 3,000 years. It starts with ancient Egypt, and actually it starts in prehistory, because the caves already have paintings or illustrations of stars. So that was one thing. I had also done a similar thing for the Ulysses theme. So I'm used to this kind of riding through time. It's very exciting because you can see how things change. I mean, the theme is the same, but it changes enormously through the ages. And in the Star book, I coped with all sorts of traditions, that is, ancient Egyptian or Babylonian and whatever, but also Chinese, Native American, Viking, and so on, all over the world, as I said. I also had done a book which came out in 2015, I think, or 14 maybe, called on anagnorisis, which is agnition or recognition in Aristotle from, as it were, Homer and the Bible all the way down to more or less the 20th century. So this is what I like doing and enjoy it enormously. What happened here was, however, compared to the previous books, that there I was going, as it were, slowly in a sort of solemn and majestic manner, in a fashion, a bit like Auerbach does in Mimesis. In fact, those books were compared to Mimesis by George Steiner, for instance, and so on. But in this one, I wanted to leap from one thing to the next. I mean, there is a rational logic and trees, genealogical trees, of course, but I didn't want to spend too much time on one thing. I just wanted to get the idea, the key passage, or the key illustration, the key visual thing, and just show people, here it is. It comes out suddenly as a kind of under subterranean spring or stream, which suddenly comes out and then goes back into the earth and then comes up again, a bit like Yellowstone, as it were.
Yeah, Plato is the silent stream.
It is, and it's astonishing, because what Alfred Whitehead says then in the 20th century, that all Western philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. Well, basically he's right, It's not, I mean, even Aristotle is a footnote to Plato. It's quite a big footnote, quite a giant footnote, in fact. But he was a disciple of Plato, so Plato studied it all. And the Timaeus really has everything in it, because it starts with an account of, how the world was created or made, brought into existence by the demiurge. But then it goes on. It talks about the human body, about the elements, about everything. And there is astronomy, there is physics, there is metaphysics, of course, everything, you name it, and it's there. As I say at the beginning, the thing that came to me was that passage which I use as an epigraph from Huguccio of Pisa. Huguccio of Pisa was the author of these Magnae Derivationes, a kind of dictionary, a thematic dictionary. And he has this wonderful passage about the flower, the timo and time, of course, the plant. And I'll read the in English only.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Oh, the Latin is wonderful, but timo, he says, in Greek, in Latin flos or floreo, whence timo generally means a flower, but specifically a certain herb called timum, and its flower time or timus. From timo came timinus, timina, timinum, meaning flowery or sweet and pleasant, whence time honey is called sweet and fragrant. And here comes Plato's book, Timaeus, almost as if it were flowering, or a little flower, because it includes the flower of the whole of philosophy. But also timo or timos in Greek, in Latin mens, timos, because Plato's Timaeus contains so many things about the divine mind. And now, he's not unique, because a famous French Platonist of the 12th century, William of Conches in English, has a similar passage, so it's widespread. It's wonderful. The flower is the flower of philosophy. And so many things come up from the very beginning. From the moment they start interpreting the Timaeus, they start reading it and they say, well, what does it all mean? And they read it, they change a few things. And one key moment, I think, is when the anonymous author of the Sublime gets his hand. He talks about Plato first, and he says, well, Plato is sublime. And this comes as a surprise to you because, we are used to reading Plato, and of course it's beautiful, but I never thought Plato was sublime in that sense. But no, he says, yes, he is. And the reason why he is that he's rivaling Homer. He wants to be Homer. And so his greatness, his sublimity, as it were, is, in a sense, derivative. It comes second-hand from Homer. But that's what he really would like to do. And then he gives, the main example he gives of that comes from the Timaeus. So this is absolutely wonderful. It really serves my purpose. And Longinus was not the only one, although he was using it for aesthetic and poetic purposes. But then the later Platonists, like, for instance, Proclus, they all say, well, there are two sides to Plato in the Timaeus. There is the logic, rational, and there is the Pythagorean inspiration and the poetic thing and so on. And the reason why the poem I wrote was called Plato's poem is that Cornford, the famous commentator on Plato, on the Timaeus, says, well, what Plato does in the Timaeus is write a poem, no more, no less than Lucretius in the Rerum Natura. So, yes, it's true. Once you start reading it in that light, it becomes very, very obvious that that's what he's doing. Plato is definitely a poet, which Aristotle is not. Aristotle might be right, but he's not a poet. He likes poetry, of course, and ultimately saves it, whereas Plato accurately condemns it, or partially at least condemns it. But Plato is a poet, definitely, in the way he writes, and the dramatic fashion he starts his career with in the Apology of in the first dialogues with Socrates, still there. Yeah. So this was a source of inspiration. And then, of course, in this long sequel of time, you can, you get more and more excited because you get to episodes like, for instance, Dionysius the Areopagite, which is a comic, almost comic one, a funny one, because there are three Dionysii, at least in theory. There's one in the Acts of the Apostles. Paul in the Areopagus, converts only one person, Dionysius. And then this Dionysius becomes the Bishop of Athens, but they fight over the Christians of Athens. There are very few, but they fight over something, and so he leaves Athens and goes to Rome. And in Rome, The chronology is completely, invented, completely wrong. But in Rome, he becomes a friend of Pope Clement, and Pope Clement immediately ships him to France to convert the Gauls. And so he arrives to be the bishop of Paris, and the local priests, the pagan priests, capture him immediately and behead him. And so he lifts up his head, washes it in a nearby spring, and walks for several miles until he gets to the place where the future abbey of Saint Denis will be. Saint Denis is Pseudo-Dionysius, will be built, and the abbey is duly built and so on. And then, of course, this is the second Dionysius in a sense, so it's Saint Denis, a saint. In the meantime, somebody in the 6th century in Syria, people think now, as scholars think now, pretends to be an apostolic witness and writes these wonderful treatises, mystical treatises. And the Greek fathers eventually accept him as real and true. And so this is where he becomes the important Dionysius. But in the West, of course, they have no idea, because they can't read Greek anymore. Only, Johannes Scotus Eriugena can. So finally, the Emperor of Constantinople, Manuel II, I think, sends a copy to the King of the Franks, to France, in 827. And the king asked Hilduin, the abbot of Saint Denis, to translate this thing. And Hilduin gathers a group of people to translate it, and he produces a translation which is not particularly good, but there it is anyway. And he writes an introduction with a biography of Saint Denis. So he puts, the other thing together with the former one.
Can I just say very quickly that story of the translation is so striking because in a way it's an inversion of the story of the translation of the Septuagint. But in this case, it's the Greek text that has, the immediate urgency, a team translation around it that is going to be just so incredibly important.
It is, and then they fight over this, and for centuries afterwards they produce different translations. Johannes Scotus Eriugena, about 60 years later, does his. He knows Greek, and so it's a much better translation. And it goes on with several until Marsilio Ficino in the 15th century, and that's the end of it. Marsilio, interestingly enough, translates Dionysius as well as Plato, because that's the other amazing story. I have it here, but I can't show it to you. It's too enormous and too heavy. When Cosimo de' Medici finally receives a copy of all the dialogues of Plato in Greek, he calls Marsilio and says, well, drop whatever you're doing and do this. Translate the whole of Plato. And Marsilio produces a translation of the whole of Plato in 6 months. It's astonishing into Latin. And
I don't think I could read the whole of Plato in 6 months.
Exactly, but it's absolutely wonderful. It's one of the best translations. And in fact, I have it in a 17th century copy, big folio volume. And I have another edition as well, and a 16th century edition. But so the story gets, more and more complicated. And of course, what Dionysius insists on is the idea, the concept, and so on, of beauty, which is the most important thing, and for me. And it picks up, he glosses mysticism, as it were, with Plato. He takes Symposium and Phaedrus and uses them in the commentary on the names of God or the mystical theology and so on. So it becomes more and more exciting. And the Dionysius' successors in the Middle Ages, well, they include, of course, Johannes Scotus Eriugena, who's a fantastic Irish writer, and they include even people like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas, who are much more down to earth, and of course they are Aristotelians in many ways, but when they find themselves confronted by Dionysius, they go berserk, especially Thomas. I think even I have the De Divinis Nominibus in Thomas's commentary as well. And it's the one Platonic, sort of Platonistic, one would say, work in a big Aristotelian series for Thomas. And then there is Dante. And of course, one of the best poets ever, who only picks up what interests him is mostly Aristotelian, mostly Thomistic, let's say, or inspired by Albert. But when the need comes, when he reaches paradise, how on earth, in paradise, can you actually describe paradise, heaven, without using metaphors? It's impossible, because the characters themselves are lights. They have no body. So you have to have an incredible kind of imagination, and he does. It's an incredible feat to reach. People normally love the Inferno, hell, because it's so vivid and so full of details and all. But when he gets to Paradiso, he becomes really a kind of ascetic mind. But if you can penetrate it, it's poetry of the absolute, basically, and very difficult to do. Only a few people, like, for instance, T.S. Eliot, I think, in the four quartets, particularly in the last one, get to that in the 20th century, or Rilke, it's not. Milton approaches it in Paradise Lost, but it's a very different thing. So, one gets carried away, as it were.
Well, to go to the other end of the spectrum from the description of paradise to an account of the creation, could you possibly say a few words about the Timaeus' account of creation and the legacy of that, maybe specifically in terms of Philo of Alexandria's work, to use the Timaeus as a way to understand Genesis?
It was Kepler who said that the best gloss ever on the book of Genesis was Plato's Timaeus. Kepler, can you imagine, the man who described the orbits of the solar system, and a scientist, an astronomer, imperial astronomer in Prague, of all things. He was also an astrologist, but still quite a serious man. Anyway, yes, the account is simple in a sense. It starts with the maker, as he calls it, the demiurge, who shapes. The creation as such is a very Hebrew and Christian thing, but he shapes the universe out of pre-existing material. This is the important thing. But what he shapes, what he makes, the word is poiein, so poetess, of course, is the actual maker, the poet. What he makes must be perfect, because he's perfect, and it must be perfectly beautiful, the kalistos, as it were, the most beautiful. So he uses pre-existing material to make this universe, which is a living animal and has a soul. And from here first he uses geometrical images, triangles, cubes, squares, and things, That's why here you have the this is Kandinsky actually, but it's that idea. And then he goes into the actual living body, the actual articulations of the living body, and he uses images for the body of man, and woman, and the image of the universe as a living animal. And this is so attractive to people that they go on commenting on this for the next 2,000 years or more. It reaches down to the 20th century anyway. And also in the visual arts, because of course the appeal of the beautiful it's a way in which, in the end, it's a way in which Christianity, which at the beginning, refuses all aesthetic ideas. The first Christians are Talibans in many ways. They, all the beauty of classical temples and things, no, this is all to be rejected. But it is impossible to do without, in the West at least, in Rome. Fortunately, it's Rome and not Jerusalem and other places like that. And it's impossible in Rome. The Christians, Paul and Peter, came to Rome, so they had to face pagan Roman and Greco-Roman paganism. And it's impossible for any man, any person in the West to do completely without beauty. And for instance, to do completely without Ovid, who is a very remote descendant of Plato, but he does have the maker and so on in the Metamorphoses. And well, the Metamorphoses are, they would be forbidden, of course, at the beginning of Christianity. But if you allow allegorical interpretation, then, of course, you can allow the Metamorphoses. You can say that the story of Daphne is a story about glory and pursued by Apollo, that is, pursued by the poet, and so on and so forth. And that way, all the sexual, openly lustful images in Ovid, well, they're sort of washed away and they become possible until some Renaissance, one of the many Renaissances we have in the West, does away with all the puritanical aspects and says, well, all right, we can have, we can actually have Daphne naked. It's impossible to imagine this if you come from a culture that has no images, from an iconoclastic culture like Jewish or Arab culture. No images, only geometrical patterns, and so on. But in Rome, and Rome becomes the center of Christianity, Western Christianity anyway, you have to cope with it. People will not do without images. So, and this, Plato is very good for them, because he's elevated, he's sublime, so sexual innuendos are lost in a sense, or transcended. But the aspiration to absolute beauty is there. And, the idea that what is holy is also supremely beautiful, supremely good. The Platonic transcendentals, as it were, are there. And it is, from that point of view, you can understand why at the beginning of the Renaissance in the 15th century, people like, say, Raphael and Michelangelo, in a different way, of course, but they all use this kind of Platonic background.
Yeah, I was hoping to fast forward a bit, actually, to Renaissance Rome and to ask you about Raphael's engagement with the Timaeus, specifically with in the Chigi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo and the incredible mosaics. Could you say a few words about Raphael's take on the Timaeus?
The most important painting in this respect is the famous School of Athens in the Vatican. There is a room which is called the Natura, because papers were signed there, and completely covered by frescoes. Now, the most important one is this School of Athens, where he paints at the very center of the painting precisely Plato and Aristotle, both standing. And Aristotle holds the ethics, the Nicomachaean ethics in his hands, and Plato a big folio copy of the Timaeus under his arm. Plato has his finger up, meaning that's where I look.
Yeah, pointing to the heavens. Mm-hmm.
Right, and Aristotle had his hand down, pointing to the earth, because okay. So then the entire room becomes, in fact, a philosophy, because in front of that is the fresco, is the Holy Sacrament at Bolsena, famous miracle. But what it represents, it's the earthly church and the heavenly church. And down there you can see, various saints and popes and cardinals and so on. There is also, among them, there's Dante and Thomas Aquinas together in the down ground floor, or the ground floor. Then there's another wall, the third wall, which has Mount Parnassus and all the poets and so on, the artists and the muses, of course. And at the top, there's Homer with Virgil and Dante. So Raphael has already decided the triad at the top, and this is of course before the times of Shakespeare and Goethe, but it's a beautiful painting as well, a beautiful fresco. And then there's the vault, where he has a young Sophia, or wisdom, moving the earth, or moving, not the earth, but the universe. This is the cover of the Italian edition of the book, which has precisely that, you see. And so that the entire thing is, in fact, it joins the Platonic ideal with the Christian one, with theology, as it were, but all in Plato's spirit, as it were. That is once removed, I think, in Michelangelo's paintings on the frescoes on the vault of the Sistine Chapel, because there he has God himself appear, the old man with a beard, very heavy, undressed or dressed, as the case might be in various paintings. There's one in which you can see God's bottom. And, I remember being in the Sistine Chapel with a cardinal once, and I said, Your Eminence, have you seen God's bottom? And he said, Oh, Professor, what are you saying? I said, well, there, look. It's actually because, you cannot see God face to face. You will see me only behind, the scripture says. And so Michelangelo literally paints the behind, as it were. But the distortions, the movements he gives to this body of God are amazing. And finally, the unmoved mover, really moves quickly, very fast, and very powerfully as well in Michelangelo. So, where was I? I got carried away as usual.
With Raphael, yeah.
Raphael, yes. Well, everything is, Platonism comes back with the Medici, really, because there's a school in Florence, of course, where Michelangelo attended, by the way, not Raphael, because he was from Urbino, but there were other ways in which he would absorb it. And, you get it in Botticelli, for instance. The famous Birth of Venus is entirely Platonic, and all the people, there's a Platonic circle in Florence, or Neoplatonic, if you like, with Marsilio Ficino and Michelangelo, and also Pico della Mirandola, and commentator on Dante, and so on. So, it's all very important. They reinterpret scripture to begin with, and Dante, and so on. And it's a very powerful movement, because, what had taken over from roughly the 13th and 14th century is basically Aristotle. And all universities in Italy, at least, are full of Aristotle, no Plato. But then Plato comes back, the whole of it, in the 15th century, translated by Marsilio, by Ficino. So they fall to their knees at this point. And this is something that then spreads throughout Europe, for instance, to England, where you have the Cambridge Platonists in the 17th century, so later. But again, the movement takes over the whole of Europe. And they start looking at heaven again, looking at the world of ideas and things. It's basically a different way of looking at things. I remember when I went to Japan, and when I show you one cherry tree after another, and you're supposed to contemplate each one of them. After a while, I thought, but they're all the same. I have 2 cherry trees on my own farm on Sublime Hills. I said, it's not true, but basically you have the impression that all cherry trees are similar, because they all are the cherry treeness, as it were, as a Platonic idea of the cherry tree.
We're all partaking of the cherry tree form.
That's right, exactly. And, it's not true, of course. The Japanese themselves are obviously more Aristotle inclined than Plato inclined. They contemplate each single cherry tree, and they insist that you do the same and see the differences and so on, which is undoubtedly true. But also, there is a way of looking at cherry trees and saying there exists a form which is the cherry treeness of things. Is a different way of looking at it. And it introduces into European thought something that will re-emerge in the 20th century. For instance, theory, well, like Heisenberg says, for instance, Plato would have accepted the quantum theory and the relativity theory in a way that Aristotle simply could not imagine, because Plato is open. As long as you talk about geometrical form, mathematical operations, then it's fine. And so he would be in the same way in which he would be open to evolution theory, whereas Aristotle wouldn't. And Whitehead does the same in his book. And it's true, Plato would have been more open. Now, there are other things that one can say against Plato, of course. His political theory, his, he's, well, yes, called a friend of tyrants and so on, which is true in a sense. But there are forms of tyranny which are much worse than Plato. Alas, we see it every day.
Well, I think that from this book, one walks away, or at least this reader walked away with just such an overwhelming sense of how different the world we live in would be were it not for the Timaeus, just how it sort of trickled into everything. And without even knowing it, it is the kind of cultural, spiritual air that we breathe even still today. And I think it's really remarkable how you told this very complex story and a set of, as you describe, these short lyrical essays kind of picking up, individual threads, but also constantly bearing in mind what you call the family tree of influence. It's really remarkable. Well, Piero, could I ask, there's a tradition with the podcast where I conclude the conversations by asking guests what they have been doing lately or reading or listening to that has been bringing some joy. Times are difficult these days, and I'm curious how you might answer that question. What have you been enjoying lately?
Well, I haven't been enjoying much in the last month or so, but before, yes, I've been devoting myself to poetry mostly before the book came out, actually. The book came out in November, I think. I've written quite a bit, and there's a major thing is coming out in, I think, February, in English again, but also with Italian translation, in a famous series where the great poets of the Italian 20th century, like Montale and Ungaretti and so on, published theirs. This is called The Five Elements, so it's devoted to the five elements, intertwined with my experience, my sort of life of living with or in the elements, again, throughout the world. And I wrote it after Plato's poem, and then a famous poetess translated it, and it's coming out soon. And so I've written, more and more. I also, in the month of September, for the first time in my life, I went to Ithaca, Greece, the island of Ulysses, which I had looked at from very far away from a boat about 50 years ago, or 60. And as soon as I landed, I started writing short poems in this case, but it's become a kind of thing. I'm writing continuously short things about Ithaca. I called it the Canzoniere from Ithaca. And some of these poems, I was lucky, 4 of them, in fact, were taken by Arion, the American periodical. So they're coming out in their winter issue.
So it seems that Timaeus has changed your life in a very, very concrete way, too. There's all this enthusiasmos says.
Enthusiasmos, yes. Or mania, as Plato. Yes, no. Oh, yeah.
Well, Piero, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's a beautiful book. It's a fascinating book. It's an important book. And so thank you so much for publishing it, for sharing with us, and for joining me in this conversation.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.